Dogs are funny animals, often doing weird and wonderful things to get our attention. George Miller knew that his dog Crosby was trying to tell him something, but couldn't figure out what it was. Stay tuned to find out what happened when a dog stared at a wall for days, so the owner has set up a hidden camera to find out why. Before we hear about George and Crosby, we have another similar story to share with you today. In General Roca, Argentina, there is something strange that happens every day that locals and tourists can't seem to comprehend. Nobody knows why the French Mastiff Labrador cross dubbed Chico by social media users constantly stares at the blue metro wall. He only takes short breaks away from it, but nobody can steer him away from it for long. Chico spends most of his time at the blue bus stop in the Stent Final neighborhood, where he's filmed, either standing on all fours or sitting, keeping his eyes glued firmly onto the blue wall in front of him. Videos of the dog soon went viral on social media, and people started to worry about him, panicking that he might be blind or even on drugs. However, a vet checked him over and confirmed that Chico is perfectly healthy and that he could just be waiting for someone, though that still doesn't explain why he's stuck staring at the wall. Many people have tried to steer Chico away from the wall, but he always just wags his tail and keeps staring at it. Was there something behind the wall? Well, it's always a worry when animals are left on the streets on their own. Your minds can be eased by the fact that Chico currently has thousands of people looking up for him, leaving him food and water, as well as giving him affection. Why do you think he kept staring at the wall? Before we dive into our last story, George and Crosby, dogs are funny animals, often doing weird and wonderful things to get our attention, like Crosby. Stay tuned to find out what happened when a dog stared at a wall for days. So, the owner set up a hidden camera to find out why. At the age of 29, George had moved to a city far away from his family. Loneliness started to set in, so he went to the animal shelter and got a dog, a beautiful golden retriever pup that he named Crosby. Over the next 8 years, the pup grew, as did the bond between George and Crosby. What happened made George question everything. What he did made him wonder if it was the same dog he had adopted. Crosby really was a sweet dog. He loved to play with other animals. Whenever George took him to the park, Crosby would often not want to leave. After he grew fond of an animal, Crosby trusted everyone he came into contact with. He could bond with everyone. This meant he grew fond of the animals next door, a cat and a dog. They had been getting up to all sorts of mischief for nearly 8 years, but then the unimaginable happened. Crosby's 2 best friends passed away, one right after the other. This left their owner very sad. But as it turns out, Crosby was devastated by what happened too. George didn't notice the change in Crosby's behavior at first. They would do the same things every day. He missed the warning signs that his beloved dog was giving him. George finally noticed when he got home after a long day of work and looked forward to his furry companion lovingly greeting him. However, what he saw instead was something that he never wanted to relive. Crosby wouldn't answer to George's calls. He soon found him staring at the wall in the living room. Why wasn't Crosby answering him? George called out Crosby's name much louder, but still no response. George crouched down next to his pal and stared at the spot on the wall. He was so fascinated with what was Crosby looking at. George was very concerned. He lovingly stroked Crosby to comfort him and suddenly made him step out of it. George looked into his dog's eyes and gave him another pat and breathed a sigh of relief. Whatever was wrong with him, he was fine now. Maybe it was just a fly on the wall, but unaware to George, it was something way bigger. Crosby had acted normal the entire night afterwards, but when George woke up thirsty in the middle of the night and passed the living room to get a glass of water, he noticed Crosby doing it again, but something appeared to be different now. A gray cloud appeared to hang over him. He looked sad as he looked intently at the same spot on the wall as earlier. George had to figure out what was wrong with Crosby. He decided to wake up extra early the following day and head straight to the shop. When he got there, he found a camera that had night vision installed. He drove back home and put it in his house before heading off to work. He figured this was the way to find out once and for all why Crosby was so enchanted with the wall. George didn't watch the footage when he got home. He decided to wait until the next day, so he'd have more footage to look through. Crosby was trying his best to tell him something. The problem was that George just couldn't understand him. He looked back at the wall that his dog was so interested in, then looked over at the monitor with the footage on it. He scratched his head, pulled himself off his chair, and went to inspect the wall. As he did so, Crosby sprinted into the room and happily wagged his tail. Crosby hadn't been this animated in days, not since his furry pals had passed away. George decided to listen to his dog and looked at the wall intently. What George found on the footage was that Crosby wouldn't stare at the wall when he was away. He'd only run up to the wall and look at it whenever he was entering the room, as if he was trying to communicate with him. Crosby let out another cheerful bark as George dropped to his knees for a closer inspection. Suddenly, he heard a noise and froze. His heartbeat raced as he tensed up and realized that something was inside the wall. His jaw dropped as he looked wildly back at Crosby. How did he know? George broke off a piece of the wooden panel that had fallen loose right next to the floor and was surprised to see a hole in the drywall. He took a deep breath and plunged his hand in until he was elbow deep. As he felt around inside, his eyes widened in disbelief. Clumps of drywall poured everywhere. But then he thought he felt something different. He grabbed hold of it carefully and pulled it out, but it was just a handful of dirt, insulation, and drywall. The cries became more urgent and he knew he was close. He dug through the dirt, clearing a way for his arm to go deeper down into the hole. What was behind it? George carefully felt around inside the hole and his fingers brushed against something small and soft. He thought it was just insulation from the wall, like before. However, in that moment, Crosby let out a high-pitched whine, as if encouraging him not to give up. His hand closed around it, and when he pulled it up again, his heart dropped. A little kitten had hidden itself within the loose wall paneling of the wall between his living room and bathroom. However, what was even more bizarre about this was that the kitten closely resembled Crosby's best friend. The tiny kitten was completely covered in dust. George had so many questions running through his head. Like, how had she gotten inside the wall in the first place? Was her mother nearby? Would she look after her? If you took her away, he had to think about what was best for the tiny. George carefully cleaned up the little kitten and gently wiped the dust away from her fur with a damp cloth. He looked down at Crosby, who was wagging his tail wildly and looking very pleased with himself. He knew all along and was chuffed that his human was able to rescue the precious kitten. The kitten couldn't have been more than a few weeks old, and George had no idea how to properly care for her. He immediately looked for the kitten's owners, but couldn't find any. He went around to all his neighbors and even hung up posters. However, he never heard anything back. Some of George's neighbors informed him that they had seen the kitten in the street before and thought that she must have been straying. George took the kitten to the vet where they checked it over, but apart from being hungry and dirty, she appeared to be in perfect health. The vet scanned the back of her neck to see if she had a microchip, but she didn't. George posted photos on his neighborhood's Facebook group, but unfortunately, nobody came forward to claim her. Time was ticking, and George knew that he had to make a decision. Crosby loved having a little kitten running around. He was becoming more and more like the joyful, goofy pup George knew him to be. However, George didn't want a cat. He didn't know how to take care of one, so he asked the vet about taking her to the animal shelter. The vet told him that if he took her to the shelter, then she'd be put down. Because there are already over 300 kittens there that need homes, that can't help everyone. George knew that if he left her outside, anything could happen to her and he wouldn't be able to live with himself if something really bad happened. So he decided to help her. Crosby was delighted as he was no longer alone and the kitten now had a loving home. George named the kitten Little Ray Ray. George realized that the more he saw how Crosby acted around Little Ray Ray, the more convinced he became that keeping the kitten was the best decision after all. Crosby even allowed the little kitten to claw on him and make herself at home in his warm fur. He put up with the kitten, even when she was using his fur as a scratching post. The three of them are all so happy living together. George is also more aware of what Crosby is doing to communicate with him now. What would you do if you caught your dog staring at the wall? Tell us in the comments below. We love hearing what you have to say. See you next time.